Good afternoon, people. Thank you very much for coming out. My name is Hal Roth. I direct the Contemplative Studies Initiative in Concentration, and I'd like to welcome you. And before we introduce our speaker for today, we're very honored to have him. I would like to say a few words to begin. Brown University is located on lands that are within the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Indian tribe, whose ancestors stewarded these lands with great care and which continues as a sovereign nation today. We acknowledge that the Narragansett tribe has been dispossessed of most of their ancestral lands in Rhode Island by the actions of individuals and institutions. We acknowledge our responsibility to understand and respond to these actions. Brown Contemplative Studies honors the Narragansett tribe and their culture, and that of all the indigenous peoples of the Americas. And we are actively exploring ways to bring their valuable epistemologies and practices into our curriculum. They have much to contribute to our world at this crucial point in human history. The Contemplative Studies, before I begin, I want to, actually should probably kill me if I don't, thank Ann Hireman-Hart, who is our administrator. And we do not get anything done without Ann's wonderful work. We're a relatively new concentration here at Brown. That's Brown speak for a major. And we've become the model for similar programs all over the continent. We approach the study and teaching of contemplative experiences from scientific, humanistic, social scientific, and artistic epistemologies and perspectives. What this means is that we study the full range of intentional and non-intentional contemplative practices from traditional third-person and second-person perspectives and innovative, critical first-person perspectives that include the newest scientific research, as well as developing a deep understanding of the cultural, historical, and personal contexts in which these practices emerge. In addition to this, we've developed methods to teach these contemplative practices in a classroom setting. This leads to the development of contemplative intelligence, the practical knowledge for how to do contemplative practices, along with the understanding of the various cultural, scientific, ethical, and political contexts through which these practices can be understood. Contemplative experiences are an important subset of the full range of human cognition. Because of their wide applicability for human health and flourishing, they deserve to be studied and taught in a distinct, multidisciplinary academic field. That is why contemplative studies was created, and that is why last month, we had the very first meeting of a professional society of people doing work in the larger fields of contemplative humanities, education, science, social science. The International Society for Contemplative Research was founded. We have about 300 members, and please look for us online. And it was there that I first heard our speaker today, Dean Michael Yellowbird. Contemplative practices sustain our bodies and minds in the quest for understanding ourselves as individuals and in relation to the broader social, political, and environmental contexts in which we exist. Contemplative sciences study the results of these practices so as to make these practices available to all people. Contemplative arts directly convey human suffering and joy and provide a vision of our unrealized potential. Contemplative philosophies contextualize our efforts so we never lose our common humanity. Contemplative intelligence maximizes the influence of our efforts while supporting the wisdom and compassion with which we make them. So I want to welcome you on behalf of the Contemplative Studies program, also on behalf of the Center for Mindfulness, and from the Native American and Indigenous Studies Initiative, I'd like to welcome Kelly O'Brien, who will introduce our speaker.
Hi. So Dr. Michael Yellowbird received his Bachelor's of Social Work from the University of North Dakota in 1979 and his PhD from the University of Wisconsin in 1994. Presently, he is the Dean of Faculty of Social Work at the University of Manitoba. He is a citizen of the 3 affiliated tribes and grew up in North Dakota, but on one of his trips to Alaska, he was adopted by the Yupiks, which is my tribe. And this presentation is going to discuss colonization, decolonization, and neurodecolonization and their role in Indigenous people's health. And this combination of Western science and Indigenous practices is at the core of Dr. Yellowbird's research practice. So welcome. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation first to be here. Thank you to the people whose land and territory I'm on right now. It's a pleasure and it's an honor to be here. I want to just make a point and show you that this presentation I did is one I did in San Diego earlier. So I thought it was something that when I thought about doing this contemplative work, I was really thinking about how I could frame this in terms of contemplative science, contemplative culture, and Indigenous people. And so what I did is I took a deep dive into my lineage of contemplation. And so I'll talk a bit about that today, but also talk about some of the current work that I do. And it's been a pleasure for me to have work and be an advisory to the Mindfulness Center too. I work with the folks there too. So they've been very inviting. And I want to thank Jeff too for his getting me over here and everyone else who was involved in that too as well. So thank you so much. I want to start with this first slide here. Two of my daughters, my oldest daughter, who's sitting there with a yellow shirt on, and my other daughter, Pachiparino and Arendati, their names, sitting there, and they're both meditators. All my kids are meditators. And I understand the importance of contemplative practices, and I grew up with contemplative practices for years. And so in my presentation, I want to talk a bit about this. My primary focus of my work has been attempting to understand how Western neuroscience and genetic science can be used to determine what was happening to the Indigenous brain and body when people were engaged in ceremony, engaged in everyday life, back in the day. I use these sciences to explain, what might be happening, in the body and brain, and what's happening, to the body and brain when people are chronically stressed, from colonization and oppression. And so that kind of trauma has, been a big interest of mine too as well. In this particular picture, you see 4 dancers, and these are people from my community. These folks were called the night dancers, these men. And really the contemplative practices of this particular society, of this group, was contemplating the night, the darkness, the void, whatever doesn't exist, they are there. And to be with or to be without, and also to contemplate dreams and the meaning of dreams, which a lot of Indigenous people did, have dream societies. So what about the dream world? How does it inform our waking world, which was really a big part of what these men were doing? So as they're there, they're singing these sacred songs, they're moving around the tree, and of course they're talking about this kind of thing. So I want to talk about, colonization, decolonization, and some of the things that I've mentioned, but this picture, next picture is a picture of what we call the Arikara Bear Society. My father and mother are both Arikara. My mother is Hiradza. And so we're 3 affiliated tribes, the Mandan, Hiradza, and Arikara. We were affected a lot in the 1870s by, early 1870s by, 1700s by smallpox, and that kind of went all the way up. So the numbers diminished quite a bit. But this is a picture of the Arikara Bear Society singers. On my mother's side, I'm called a child of the Bear Society, right? And I remain a child of this society because I haven't been initiated into this group. And the initiation stopped in the late 1900s, late 1950s due to the pressure of colonization. So a lot of people like me didn't get an identity with that kind of lineage, right? And as you'll see, that was very important too, to kind of have a connection to that lineage. The contemplative practices of the society focused on composing songs, dances, and behaviors that fostered strength and courage in people of the village in order to cope with food scarcity, climate change, war, rates of high infant mortality, disease, and other kinds of challenges. So this society was kind of that, the cheerleader to build resiliency in the community. And the Bears, like many of our contemplative societies, prior to US colonization and imperialism, maintained a vital connection to the natural and supernatural worlds. They were kind of like the conduits, and they talked to people about that. Their ceremonies served as a conduit to these worlds, and where people made relatives with all living things, the land, the waters, and the cosmos. So as you can see, that contemplation was a huge part of Indigenous people's lives. They were contemplating these things all the time. This picture, by the way, is staged in the early 1900s by someone by the name of Edward Curtis, who was out in our part of the territory when he was documenting what he called the vanishing Indian. The ceremonies that had been banned by the federal government were allowed to go on at this time so that there could be a record of that, because they thought, these things were all going to die off and go away. And again, again, that's just part of the colonization. So this guy here, his name is Bear's Belly. And has anyone ever seen this picture? It's a very popular picture when you go into stores like Walmart and places like that. They sell prints of these things, right? They lift these prints and they sell them. You can find them online. This particular print's probably worth about, $50,000 right now. And it's just what they call a photogravure, which is pressed. So there's not too many of them left. But Bear's Belly was a member of the Irikara Bear Society too, a group known for strength and enacting this power and the mysteriousness of the bear, right? The bear was, this creature that embodied all these different qualities of strength. The members of the group painted their bodies red, which was a sacred color. Their calves of their legs were painted black, and they wore a red circle on their chest. Bear's Belly, the man in this picture, was a sacred singer who, during the sacred medicine lodge ceremonies that we had in these big earth lodges, touched what they called the sacred tree of life. And not everyone could go up and touch the sacred tree of life. You had to live it like an impeccable kind of character. You had to respect, that. So you had to kind of leave all that behind and be humble and move to that place, that connection, and contemplate on that, humility a lot. The Bear Society was responsible for feeding the spears of the bear and other creatures. In order to get the bear covering that you see on him, it's a grizzly bear. In this picture, Bear's Belly went out on his own and found grizzly bears and single-handedly dispatched 3 of them, right? And the bear, as they say, became his medicine. So what's interesting when I look at this research says, according to new research, your reaction, to fear may have less to do with logically analyzing the situation and more to do with what are called bravery cells, right? Bravery cells. So I was reading up on bravery cells that light up in your response to threat. So the idea of being a warrior or someone that challenges, the fear and that sort of thing, probably, according to Western science, may have some highly active bravery cells going on, right? So according to this new research, as I was saying, your reaction to a threat is like going after, like he did, like Bear's Belly, going after 3 grizzly bears with a kitchen knife, right? May have less to do with logically analyzing the situation, more to do with the bravery cells. And in this particular picture here, these are Bear Society dancers, of course, enacting the dances and behaviors of bears. What we know a little bit about, and this hasn't been replicated, I think, very well yet, but found that, holding these positions, postures called, powerful postures, leads to increased levels of testosterone and the decrease of cortisol. Probably if you tested these guys who are all in the society, you would see a rise in oxytocin too as well. All their friends who were doing this all together, right? A rise in norepinephrine, the alertness and that kind of thing. And of course, that would mediate a lot of that cortisol, because of the rise of testosterone. My grandfather here, his name was Gakanaksanu, or crow ghost. He was a well-known contemplative who spent time meditating among the burial grounds of our deceased, among the spirits. When you've probably heard about the Hindu charnel grounds, where people go and meditate among the deceased there. It's very similar in that way. His gift was receiving messages from the spirit world, which he'd communicate to the people, reminding us that we are not in this world, alone, and we're here for a very short time, and we should not become too attached to this life, which I think is kind of interesting about when you think about Buddhist philosophy and detachment, right? That kind of thinking, and that he taught that we should always use our time wisely and live in a life of humility, generosity, and gratitude. This is what he was always kind of talking about, to the people. He was what they called the caretaker of the sacred bundle, right, of the deceased. And he served as a conduit to the natural and supernatural worlds. And his contemplations were around the deceased and the caretaker of this kind of sacred way. This next picture is another one of my grandfathers. His name is Bear's Teeth. Ganuhananu is what they call him, Ganuhananu, which means the strong. It's like the bear's teeth, which are like perennial. I mean, they're permanent. They're strong. They're fierce, right? He was given that name, but he became a prophet. He was given that name as a young boy, but he became a prophet, became a well-known prophet who was gifted, from the spirits, many kinds of medicines that he used to heal animals, to heal people. One of the things that was really important about him, and when settlers came through, in their journals they wrote about him, so you can read about him, that he was a rainmaker or a rain caller. More, during a drought, he would call in the rains. And he did this many times. He was observed to do this many times. So when they go into lodge, into ceremony, he would sing and he'd call in the rains. There's even a bit of the ceremony that was written out. And he could speak to the spirits of the waters. He kind of understood waters and with the feelings and the emotions that the waters manifested themselves and how they were related to human emotions. So his contemplative life focused on healing, seeing, and meditations on rivers, streams, rains, and storms, and all the life and all the creatures that live in the waters. I use the medicine wheel. Some of you have maybe seen the medicine wheel, which represents the alignment and the continuous interaction of the physical, the emotional, the mental, and the spiritual realities that Indigenous people live with. The circle represents the interconnectivity of all the aspects of one's being, including the connection to the natural and supernatural worlds. I don't have a slide in here, but I have a slide back home when we talk about supernatural and spirit world, where there was a guy who does travel logs. I guess he came to our reservation and he was taking pictures of old houses on our reservation. Took a picture one, and after he looked at it, it developed. There was a spirit standing in the doorway, and the spirit had one of those military uniforms from boarding school days. You can see that. It's really interesting when you look at that picture, right? I was kind of looking at it. It's, it wasn't photoshopped. It's pretty clear that, he caught it, and he was like, and then all the people saw that. Then all people on the reservation all had a conversation who that was and whose house it was, because it was an old house on the reservation that had been abandoned for many, many years. Medicine wheels are frequently believed to be the circle of awareness of an individual self, the circle of knowledge that provides the power we each have over our own lives. And in this particular model, as you can see, the mind part in the work that I do focuses around, the brain, neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, and all these things that are happening in the brain. Another part of the body, I focus a lot on the human microbiome and what I call the new great circle of life, right? All these trillions of bacteria that live inside of us that have strong relationship to our health and our well-being, mental health and physical health. The medicine wheel, I think, when we look at, not only the body and the brain, but also the contemplative practices that our ancestors did, along with what we had inherited genetically down the line, and epigenetically what happens to us when we're put into a situation like colonization and oppression that makes us vulnerable to different kinds of illnesses, are things to consider. Maybe I take a question around genetics, and I talked about it a little earlier today, but if folks are interested in some of the work that I've been looking at in terms of genetics. So when I think about the human microbiome, like, what's been happening, in settler society, is that there's a lot of disruptions happening. And the biggest disruption has, kind of been in the human microbiome is overuse of antibiotics. Not only poor food or food choices and fast foods, those kinds of things, but indigenous people, they fasted a lot. They ate a lot of high plant fiber, and so on to feed the microbiome. But the overuse of antibiotics and C-sections and processed foods, have been driving the destruction of our inner ecology here faster. This is what it says in this book, The Invisible Extinction is happening faster than climate change. So we realize that, we need to contemplate on that kind of thing, like what we're eating and what it does for us or doesn't do for us. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about kind of some of the models that I developed around colonization, decolonization. So just pretty straightforward, invasion is about, colonization. The first stage is unwelcome intrusion, people, ideas, beliefs, diseases. The next stage is the contamination stage, where toxic and harmful contact and interactions happen. The third stage is the culture then begins to be infected by colonization. The diseases, the ideas, the values, and the changes in the culture becomes overwhelmed, can become overwhelmed, and sickness and decay and death phase sets in. So we're not really colonized until we survive those first three stages, right? Then those ideas, those beliefs, those values become part of who we are. And we can function in a colonial society. I was talking with students this afternoon about, a bit about colonization and about, all the different kinds of things we've kind of taken in from settler society, like behaviors and foods and ideas and thinking and those kinds of things. Some of those things are compatible with indigenous people, some aren't. So we still remain vulnerable to these processes and structures of colonialism. I like this quote by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. She talks about, how all these different kinds of things were happening, torture, terror, sexual abuse, all the way down to, termination policies, which were all part of the colonization, which had, direct effects on populations and people. And of course, that, is traumatic. When you think about exposure to colonization, think about it in the long term where the Catholic Church and Pope Alexander VI called for the barbarous nations to be subjugated and brought to the Catholic faith and Christian religion for the propagation of the Christian empire, right? And the last bullet point, is again, how do you traumatize people, really deeply as you remove them from their lands and you take away their territory, right? And this is what, still exists today as what they call the doctrine of discovery of the papal bull. Anytime Christians entered into the lands of non-Christians, their land became, the possession of the discoverers. Some of you have probably seen this, the Declaration of Independence. Indigenous people are the only group that are mentioned of all groups in the Declaration of Independence, and they're called the merciless Indian savages, whose only known rule of war is indiscriminate killing of everybody, right? So it's like, what's that saying? You call the kettle calling the pot black, sort of thing, right? Anyway, this is one of the most sacred documents in the United States, the Declaration of Independence against, King George and whatever. So, how many people have seen this picture? So a lot of folks have seen it, yeah. So about Colombia. So, but I'll point out a few things here. I don't have a laser pointer here, but if you look at Colombia, of course, this is the idea of manifest destiny, or expansionism, American progress. John Gass did this painting, and it was kind of done for a travelogue so that it would encourage people to go out west, to move from the east. They were, taking care of the Indians, and they were, this was going on. And what's interesting is you see on the woman's name in this picture is called Columbia. She's the counterpart of Columbus, right? And you see on her head, she has a star on there. They call the Star of the Empire, right? And of course, you see the blonde hair and the fair white skin. And she's floating, sort of, levitating above the ground. And she's carrying in her arm. Do you know what she's carrying in her arm? What kind of book that is? Anyone know? Sorry. Bible? Anyone else? Constitution. Okay, it's a school book, right? It's a little more. Well, put it this way. The Bible is optional, but education in the U.S. or this part of the world is compulsory. You have the school book. You have to learn these things, right? So that's what she's carrying. But what's interesting about that is you can see behind her how light it is. That's the lightness that comes, from the civilization, and she's chasing away the darkness. So when you look at the darkness, what do you see? Well, if you're at the bottom of the page, you see a grizzly bear running, and below there you see the Indians there, right? And below them you see that creature there. People say, "Is that a res dog?" I said, "No, it's a wolf." People think it's a res dog, and then above that you see the buffalo, and they're all running away from this progress. But if you look at it and think about it for a second, I wrote a piece on this, that these are all the apex predators that were wiped out, by American settlement progress, right? The buffalo buffalo, for all intents and purposes, I don't think there's a purebred buffalo left. They had to interbreed them with cows to make the buffaloes come back. And of course, same thing with indigenous people. Probably about 10 million people. I think folks that do demography work talk about 10 million people at one point in the contiguous United States, down to about 249,000 by, I think, 1779. So think about that loss. A lot of it's from disease, from slavery. We don't talk much about slavery and so on. And then the grizzly bear almost hunted to extinction too. The wolf almost hunted to extinction. So this is kind of the progress, right? And then if you look at Colombia today, Colombia is a little fitter. She's got darker hair, and but still there on all the movies you see. If you watch Netflix, you'll see Colombia come up on Netflix and so on. They've kind of re-imaged her. There's no more Native people. I used to have someone painted a picture of the reverse of it, of American progress, and it's maybe indigenous progress. I forget the name of the painting. And in it, you see this Native woman, kind of just like Colombia. She's floating above the ground. She's got all her buckskin stuff on. And behind her, you've got all these indigenous folks coming back with all the animals, chasing away all the nuclear waste dumps and all the, all these different kinds of things that they're kind of, remaking the U.S. again. This is Henry Teller. Of course, when we're talking about 19th century colonization, the banning of indigenous sacred contemplative practices, heathenist dances and ceremonies, right? Thomas Jefferson Morgan, right? Also the incarceration of spiritual contemplative leaders, ordering up to 6 months in prison for those who were practicing, indigenous spirituality. This is a classic picture where you see all the children being removed. In Canada, we have what's going on now is all these children that are being found in these by these residential schools and unmarked graves, and that's going on now. There's people are the government of Canada has kind of got consultants in to kind of use penetrating ground radar to start finding that, and so they're identifying these children that were either murdered or died of disease or loneliness at residential schools. So the assimilation was strong. So what happened, it was in 1978, you may or may not know, that religious freedom was granted back to Native Americans, right? In 1978, after, being banned and so on. And, if you look at the actual language there, it says resolved by the Senate and the House of Representatives and so on, to protect and preserve for American Indians their inherent right to freedom to believe, express, and exercise their traditional religions, and so on, all the way down to, worship through ceremonies and traditional rites. What a lot of people didn't realize is that a lot of the ceremonies that indigenous people had relied upon sacred bodies of land, islands, forests, mountains, deserts, this really important lands, in order to do their ceremonies and to be at those places. But what we know is that, now private individuals and corporations own about 60% of the US land, and about 77 million owners own about 1.3 billion acres. So there's about 500 million acres of private land that Indigenous people don't have access to anymore, where they can do their ceremonies or where they can, the things they used to do. So it's kind of, deceptive when you think about, say, well, you have the Indian Religious Freedom Act. Why don't you just go to church or do whatever you do? And people say, well, the church is the land, it's the water, it's the mountains, these kinds of things, the rivers, right? And that's the reality. But so the lingering effects of colonialism, I won't dig too deep into that, but you may all know these different kinds of things: intergenerational trauma and PTSD, mood disorders, substance abuse, health disparities, suicide, incarceration, hate crimes, and also mismatch. And what I call mismatch is that many Indigenous people are mismatched to society today. I'm one of those people. I don't do well with some of the stuff that people do well with, like milk. I've got lactose intolerance, right? It's like my kryptonite, right? I don't do well with gluten, right? I don't do well with certain kinds of foods and stuff that are more for, dairy and those kind of cultures that, grew wheat and those kinds of things. I do better with wild foods. That's what sustains me. So if we look at trauma then, and how trauma has affected Indigenous people, I've got a term I coined: molecular colonization and molecular decolonization. So when I think about molecular colonization, it's this traumatic decay that happens at the place that we don't really see, we don't know much about until very recently, at these different levels, very tiny levels that things are happening. We can see people's emotions, we can see the levels of suicide, but we don't see what's happening on these molecular levels, these cellular levels. For instance, one of the slides I've used is what I call enzymatic colonization and chronic stress. And what we see here is a slide of what we call dendritic spines in the prefrontal cortex. And they're pretty delicate as you look at the spines. And what breaks them down is this release of what protein kinase C, which is toxic to them, breaks them down. The research shows the driver of that is stress, chronic stress, colonialism, oppression, those kinds of things that drive up that stress and break them, right? And of course, the dendritic spines are very important for learning, for memory, those kinds of things. We know that a rich environment increases spine diversity, and that's true about the brain, right? Preserve it from Alzheimer's disease and dementia if you have a rich environment where there's a lot of stimulation, a lot of sounds, a lot of song, a lot of interactions, like our ancestors did. Every day was not, kind of a boring, no one would say today's boring, right? It was like people were constantly on the move, looking for food, interacting with other groups, leading this contemplative life, trying not to forget any of these different kinds of things that would upset the stability of the spiritual society, the cultural society, those kinds of things. There was a lot of oral history, a lot of storytelling, so that, it exercised that part of the hippocampus, so that you had to have that memory rich. You didn't have, AI, or you didn't have, Google or anything you could go look it up. It was all there in the memory, and was constantly being reinforced through story, through song, through different kinds of activities. That was the rich environment. People were walking up hills, ducking under branches, swimming across cold rivers, inventing, different kinds of varieties of corn and beans and squash, all these different kinds of things, and learning different languages. And among my people and the 3 affiliated tribes, people knew at least 3 languages: their own, Mandan, Hidatsa, then they knew Lakota, Dakota language, Cheyenne language. Then they had a trade language and a sign language. All these different kinds of languages. Think about what it does to the brain, right? So another thing is, when I think about stress and trauma and colonization, about the colonization of the telomere or the chromosome. The telomere at the end of the chromosome, it's kind of is an indicator of well-being, at least in some research showing that. And it talks about how as the cells die, and become senescent, of course, they don't reproduce and telomeres get shorter, right? And of course, we know that, cellular aging happens quicker when there's a chronic stress. So you want to keep nice, healthy, long cells. So this is kind of, this picture is a little bit ageist in a sense, because, grandpa can have nice long telomeres too if grandpa follows a prescription for living a traditional life, walking, moving, eating the right foods, laughing with his grandchildren, doing all these kinds of things, lifting heavy weights, right, running distances, and and maintaining a sense of spirituality and mindfulness, right? This molecular colonization, of course, then kind of we look at these studies that have been done in middle-aged populations, how people who are physically active have longer telomeres and they're comparable to younger folks, right? And that's a good thing because on the molecular level they're younger. But the power of the stress in this particular study here shows that telomere lengths are shortest for both depressed and healthy participants who are experiencing chronic stress, right? So even though if you feel like you're healthy, but every day your cortisol levels are being jacked up because you're having traumatic memories, or you have come from a home or a community where there's a lot of, you've had to experience a lot of things. It's constantly there. And if you've inherited, genes that help express for that, and they're in an epigenetic environment that encourages it, the telomeres are going to get shorter. The one that, this is 2007, but I always show this one because it shows the sign of stress on early life of children. We know that, kids that live in the most loving homes have telomeres, that are as long as they should be. Kids that live in, challenging situations, like I'm a social work professor. I study this quite a bit, look at Indigenous communities where they're really challenged, probably these kids are going to have shorter telomeres, which means they're biologically older, which means that in this particular study, it says that, children living in the most stressful homes have telomeres that are 40% shorter. That means, in a sense, that these kids are going to get the diseases of aging earlier, the diabetes, the dementias, the heart disease, the obesity, all these metabolic diseases, right? Something that, and depression, right? These are novel diseases. Depression is a novel disease with Indigenous people, as I would say, probably is blood pressure, and obesity is something that happened, but it's very, very low among those groups. So think about that chronic stress that's happening with kids. And moms also pass on shorter telomeres to their kids. Elizabeth Blackburn did this research. She was a Nobel Prize winner for this, her study of telomeres. But what's interesting is that moms actually pass on shorter telomeres to kids, so the kids are born biologically older. I was talking about that earlier. I said I was one of those kids that was born biologically older, I think, right? Because I did my mom's DNA test. My mom passed away a couple of years ago at age 94. But I did her DNA, then I had it reevaluated and looked at her telomeres and all the markers, all the probability of have shortened telomeres. She's got a lot of markers for that. And guess what? I got a lot of those markers too. My dad's side, they didn't get those kinds of markers. So what in life factors for women, which was really interesting. There's a story that my mother used to tell about in the birthing lodges long ago. She said that women in their communities, these Indigenous women in these communities, were not allowed to see war or blood or hear, angry things. That they were there in this lodge, surrounded by other women who would, nurture them and talk to them and sing these sacred songs, because they knew that babies that were affected by these kinds of things, just like this research is talking about now. They're passed down so that they knew, in order to have a healthy. My mom used to always tell this story with kids who used to, don't look at this, don't look at that kind of stuff, because if it caused fear, of course, it would raise the levels of cortisol and all those kinds of things. But they didn't call it that. They just said, you have to be very careful about, what a woman experiences or sees. Should not experience, physical harm or fear, those kinds of things. Anyway, life factors that affect, Indigenous women, today are hate crimes, missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, all kinds of abuse, poverty, isolation, violence, mocking of Indigenous women, ridicule, exclusion, stereotyping, sexual trafficking, and all these things, all the way down to these memes and tropes of hate, the squaw and the name. I saw where I think my son was telling me that they were changing some names in California. There was like the Squaw River and whatever, but they were changing these names, because the Indigenous people have been protesting against those kinds of names for a long time. If you know the term squaw, is a very disparaging term for a woman, Indigenous woman. So decolonization, what is that about? Well, the model that I work from is three stages. Decolonization. There's a cleansing period that happens. It's like decolonization is nothing new for Indigenous people. Right? They go out and they get colonized by war, they get colonized by these feelings, whatever. They have to come back and they have to cleanse themselves, right, from this harmful thinking and beliefs and values, all those kinds of things that are imposed by these systems. In this particular thing, I'm talking about colonizing structures. And there's then the Renaissance period where Indigenous people then begin to return to the practices and the values and the beliefs that were taken away or abandoned during a period of colonization, but they're necessary for survival today. And part of those, that I'm talking about today are those contemplative practices I'm talking about. How do we return to those contemplative practices? That my grandfather, Kakanaksano, who spoke to the spirits, or my grandfather, Bear's Teeth, who could call the rain, or Bear's Belly, who had this respect for all living and natural things, right? And how do we get back to that? And that's part of the Renaissance that, a lot of young people are kind of involved in today. The Enlightenment period is the idea of how do you bring about new ideas, new technologies and lifestyles that contribute to empowerment of Indigenous people, right? So I was mentioning today with the group I was talking to about, and talking to our PhD students a few days ago, and I said, gee, what would it be like to have a grandma who was an AI robot grandma, right? An Indigenous elder grandma that looked like my grandma, but she could speak like my grandma. If there was just a tape that was 30 seconds long of my grandmother speaking, the AI could read that and speak just like my grandmother, and can speak the language just like my grandmother, and it could speak all the Arikara words with that, and look just like her. If you had these teaching kids, right? So it's provocative. I throw it out there and say, what do you think about that, right? So. Some of the contemplative practices around cleansing, right, is some of the practices that I do with folks is encourage an inventory of one's thoughts and beliefs and how they're shaped by colonization. It's a little different than, mindfulness, where you kind of pay attention to it, then you let it go and you focus on the breath, you anchor on the breath. So this is, kind of get people kind of more deeply into it. How do they create a safe, practice and secure place for one who is cleansing from colonization, right? You create that place, whether it's, home or whether it's in your community or whatever. Build a sense of triumph over colonialism and encourage a mindful confrontation with colonization, right? How do we confront colonization, right? I wrote an article with about, 4 other people called Defunding Mindfulness, right? And it was talking about how we as people in the contemplative and mindfulness world need to do a lot more activism. That was right around the time that George Floyd was murdered, right? And then the last piece there is practices, enlightenment practices, right? Creativity, like imagining new things. And I talk to people about that quite a bit, like imagine this, imagine that, extend this thinking, extend that kind of thinking. So neurodecolonization is decolonizing the mind and the body. What does that mean? Well, it's really using what I call mainstream mindfulness, Eastern meditation practices. It could be like MBSR or just any kind of practice as springboards to start to do more Indigenous contemplative practices. Anything that weakens the effects of colonization. This particular picture, my brother, who's an artist, painted this picture for one of our books called For Indigenous Minds Only. And in this picture, you can see where, you have the brain there. And what he said, I was talking to him about, the picture I wanted. He said, so he came back with this picture. And I'm like, okay. He didn't do what I asked him to do with my younger brother, right? So he said, I got a better idea. I said, okay, tell me what your idea is. So he said, you're always talking about the brain, how the brain needs to be healed. I said, yeah. And you're talking about culture, right? I said, yep. So he said, here we got this holy person smudging the brain off, right? And we got this other holy person singing to the brain traditional songs. And I said, he's a horse guy too. He used to train horses. Oh, we did, but he's much more than I did, train horses. And I said, okay, so he got his horses in there. So tell me what the horses are. He said, remember those neurons you're always talking about? They're firing now, right? And where are they going? I said, they're going back to the village, right? They're going back to the teepees and go back to the village life. He said, that's what you want him to do, right? I said, yeah, of course, I didn't think of that. He thought of that. So that was his idea. So this is neurodecolonization, right? It's how do we decolonize the mind, And of course, it's the contemplative practices and the singing and those activities that, release the brain from its captivity of colonialism. So I call it also mindful activism, anti-colonialism, truth-telling, and compassionate decolonization, especially reconciling with oppressors or settlers. So neurodecolonization is about a number of practices. I'm not going to talk about all these practices, but these are practices that I thought, well, they're contemplative, but also mindfulness practices. There's a lot of science when you dig into these. Running, dancing, singing, and movement, are all in sleep rhythm, circadian rhythms. Laughing and humor, collectivism, intermittent fasting or fasting, meditation, hormetic stress or hormesis, and being outside are all different kinds of things that I work on in terms of putting together a model. And these are all very traditional things that all human societies did at one time. You didn't have enough food and you had to fast, whatever, but your cells get stronger. That's hormetic stress. All societies meditated. All societies, whether they wanted to or not, they fasted too as well. So I don't want to do this too much because let's see, let me get to, movement is important. The last bullet point here looks at, the importance of endurance exercise causes adaptations in curcumin metabolism. And we know that when that conversion happens, away from this neurotoxic curcumin to the production of curinic acid, you're protected against depression. But one of the things that's interesting, because I've had many students in clinical settings in hospitals and so on. And when I was a professor at Arizona State University, I had students at the Phoenix Indian Hospital. I'd go to visit them, and the biggest diagnosis for a lot of these people that went in for the mental health was depression. A lot of depression diagnoses. I said, well, it kind of makes sense now as I fast forward. Of course, it was trauma, but there was no preventive tool that no psychiatrist was going to say, we got to start you running again. Or we got to get your heart rate up to 80% of its maximum rate, and we got to do this 3 times or 4 times a week. But the science is there now. We know that that it produces this curinic change in expression. BDNF goes up, brain-derived neurotrophic factor goes up, and that's about the growth of neurons, the neurogenesis, and also about the protection of neurons. And again, these are important for groups that have been colonized because there's a lot of cell death that happens. People smoke, they don't eat right, they don't exercise anymore, they don't live the traditional life. Endocannabinoid concentrations increase with dancing and singing. And if you look at the history of singing and dancing and among Indigenous people, you'll see that that was constant in the lives of people. And of course, endocannabinoids do all these wonderful things, right? They improve the mood and they improved your positive effects in the group. And singing, in this particular study, was the most beneficial activity. These data here and this study here provide this biochemical evidence that an increase in novel signaling messengers, kind of known as endocannabinoids, improve mood, improve and reduce stress and anxiety, enhance memory, and protect brain function and reduce pain. Imagine instead of taking CBD oil or antidepressants and anti-anxiety medicine, you danced several times a day and raised your endocannabinoids, right? Think about that. Dancing is powerful. In this particular picture, during the sacred dancing of the Arikara buffalo or bear societies, the dancer had to remember all these intricate steps, particular body actions, the words of a song, and they had needed to kind of make these actions, the rhythm and beats of the drum, and mimic the sounds or the actions of the animal that they were representing at appropriate times. So you could have all these people together, all these buffalo dancers together, and maybe other bear dancers would come in, and the bear dancers and the buffalo dancers would square off, and they have this sort of mock fight in the dance. But there were just all these different kinds of things they had to do, and so people would watch them to kind of see who would be the most realistic. To do this really required this really deep level of concentration and practice. Dancers often observed and contemplated the natural movements and habits and behaviors of the animal in order to realistically bring about the spirit of the creature into the dance. On the Western sciences as well, dance improves memory, attention, and focus. How many people dance here? How many dancers? Okay, because I'm going to get you to get up and show me your dance right now. I'm kidding. Show your moves. That's important. A lot of people don't dance. Okay. Reminds me of that show. It's that Kevin Bacon show. Footloose, yeah. No one raised their hand. It sounds like Footloose. I said maybe Brown University is like Footloose. It's outlawed to dance. Okay, you guys don't have the funny bone gene, I can see. So, okay, now you got it. So this interesting study, right? Ballroom dance program, people with mild cognitive impairment improved after dancing for 10-month-long class. Dancing also important for survival and to help form bonds between people when times were very difficult. The interesting thing about dance, I've kind of taken a dive into the dance literature too, is that Berglund's talking about this. He said, it's a part of the human experience for millennia. It's part of our collective DNA. Our bodies and brains have evolved to dance in synchronized unison, and dancing on a regular basis seems to change the way we think and interact with one another. Synchronized dancing. So if you think about it, and have you ever seen these bird murmurations? Thousands and thousands of birds flying in the same pattern like this, right? And then schooling is the same way with fish. They go into these big spinning balls to confuse the shark or the barracuda or whatever it is. On the Serengeti, zebras do the same thing. All these animals do the same thing. They run in this unison, right? And it's part of the way they interact with one another, right? With the young sometimes going into the middle and the males going on the outside or whatever. So that's a dance. And again, dance raises levels of endocannabinoids, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, reduces cortisol levels, increases serotonin, and so on. Oxytocin, I'm sure. So music then does a lot. So I'm talking about a traditional practice or the contemplative practice of singing. Here you can see all the different parts of the brain, but the empathy circuits activated, oxytocin, cortisol, language structures, and reward are all sort of part of this that are taking place here. So what about singers? Well, these are the Bear Society singers, and their meditation and contemplations around, as I said earlier, strength and courage. And as we've seen, the last slide, that singing is a very beneficial activity. The Arikara Bear Society singers' contemplations and meditations, again, as I said, were focused on strength, courage, and honoring of the spirit of the bear. In this picture, it is very likely that the brain's empathy circuits of the bear singers are activated, right? As they sing together and they respond to the music and the rhythm of the gourds, they are all doing this in unison, which is going to activate that empathy circuit. And they're not just regular gourds that you can pick up at a farmer's market, right? They're not. So where are the gourds from? So one of my grandfathers was telling me, he said, in order to get a gourd, you just don't get a gourd, right? It's gifted to you by a spiritual leader, or you get it in a ceremony. Because he said they're grown in a special spiritual manner, these gourds. And with an understanding that the spirit of the bear is overseeing and guarding these gourds. So you just don't go and get them, right? Now, whether or not you believe in the spirit of the bear or not, the fact is if you believe it, you're going to have different kinds of changes happening in the brain and on your telomeres and those kinds of things. I got the gourd that the bear protected for me. I got the strength. Think about that. Telomeres are going to grow just a little more. The BDNF in your brain is going to go up more. The oxytocin levels are going to go up more when you see all your sisters and brothers with the gourds or part of the gourd singing, right? So the singing, the shaking of the rattles, the recounting of the sacredness and the power of this moment activates dopamine reward circuitry, right? I want more. This is, making me strong. In anticipation of seeing that they will be the benefactors of the bear's gifts of courage and strength. It's also likely that their cortisol is declined and testosterone is rising. And of course, the pain blunting endocannabinoids as they're out there are happening. So think about that. Think about that toolbox of healing that you have there that precedes, everything that's Western that these folks were doing. It wasn't paganism. It wasn't primitive. It wasn't, whatever it's been labeled. These are healing mechanisms, right? That we know now about empathy, oxytocin, dopamine, cortisol, testosterone, of course, all activated. In Canada, they like to do a lot of smudge. Do you do smudge here on the campus? No? Kind of.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, gosh, the campus I'm on, people are smudging all the time. They got smudge rooms on campus, and before a meeting starts, an elder will start and they'll smudge off and so on. Go to conferences, it's all about smudging, right? And if you're a person that's been around a lot of ceremony, and you've breathed in a lot of sage smudge and cedar smudge and sweetgrass, and you're in ceremony, a lot of times there's this psychophysiological activity that goes on in the brain, right? And I think it's pretty cool because it's these different fragrances affected spontaneous brain activities and cognition functions, which are measured by these EEG, measurements, right? So what we know now from this, fairly new research, I guess, is that studies suggest that a significant role for olfactory stimulation in the alteration of cognition, mood, and social behavior. So I was back home for many years. I was a sun dancer. And I can tell you right now, just as I said that word, I can still see the can, and I can see the abalone shell, and I can smell the cedar right now. It's there. I can smell it. And so I think that, to me, that's what was one of the things, is that through these ceremonies, these medicines increased my level of concentration and contemplation whenever you hit it. It's like, the smell, right? So I do a lot of meditation yet, and I still use a lot of sage and sweetgrass, some cedar sometimes. But as you can see from the slide, that fragrance has this really powerful effect. Laughter is a big part of contemplation, right? And there you go. Some people laughed. I show this, not everybody laughs, but this guy, I think he's, I don't know, Cheyenne or Lakota, or maybe he's whatever tribe he is. But this is interesting because this Joan Chiao, who's a professor, has done a lot of work on cultural neuroscience. And I've been following her work for a few years. And she talks about how humor is encoded in our DNA. And people who have the short alleles, or with the of this particular gene, the 5-HTT-LPR, or they call it serotonin transporter gene. I call it the funny bone gene, are going to laugh a lot more, humor, right? So when I look at, indigenous societies, I see that how culturally prescribed teasing, joking, and, funny storytelling about trickster, language we say stjadij, which is the trickster, stjadij. And sacred clowns are a big part of a lot of cultures that come in. I remember the first time I seen a sacred clown, I was a little kid. I was watching this guy come in, and he was dancing around, and he had all this, stuff on. And behind him, he was at a funeral. He came dancing into a funeral. Okay. And he had behind him these straps, or these like ropes. And at the end of each rope was a beer can. So he came dancing in with beer cans, and he had commodity. So on his armbands, like commodity, if you know what USDA foods are, if you're from the res, you probably know what that is. Came dancing in, and he was, making a spectacle. So people all looked at him. Of course, they knew he's coming in. And they kept on, grieving and whatever. And he would do things that would be considered to be inappropriate, right? So I saw that and watched him, and the people didn't want to look at him. So they just kind of, But I was asking my uncle about that one time. We were at a Sundance, and he said, nephew, he said, people don't know that, but what these sacred clowns did is they brought back balance, because you're in the grief state. You're deeply into the grief. Someone passed, but they show you that life goes on, right? They in a sense, they rescue you and bring you back out of that, right? And it's that reminder, because life is short. You can't live in that grief for too long. So these were some of the things that were banned by these sacred clowns, right? I mean, you see them in the European courts too, right? The jester. So it makes sense that, when times are difficult, you need someone to take the focus off, the grieving or whatever, to kind of raise those levels of endocannabinoids and serotonin and get the lift from the dopamine and stuff, right? But in this particular gene, it's interesting because what Chiao says is that collectivist cultures have more of these individuals than cultures that are individualistic cultures. And of course, we know collectivist cultures are indigenous people throughout the world. And laughing, humor, what does it do? Well, increases your brain-derived neurotrophic factor, right? So you get, more neuron growth and protection, improves your memory and laugh and learning, which is interesting because I just wrote a book chapter that came out just recently about healthy indigenous aging. And what I found was, this dramatic rise of dementia and Alzheimer's disease among indigenous people. And people say, well, they have this APOE4 gene, which is the greatest predictor of Alzheimer's, right? Yet there are populations around the world, hunter-gatherer populations, that have the same gene that don't get Alzheimer's like we do in the Western industrial world. Even people that don't have that gene are getting high levels of that, right? And part of the thing, the people are looking at it, and they begin to kind of say, it makes a difference if people live in a more traditional lifestyle, like a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, where they're moving all the time, they have a rich environment, they're fasting sometimes, they're moving, getting their heart rates up, and those kinds of things. Of course, laughter is a big part of it, and being in a collectivist group, right? So I really appreciate this research that Joan Chiao has done, and if you want to know, what she talked about is that people who have the short or the long alleles are people from individualistic societies, more from East or Western European countries, right? So white people aren't as funny as indigenous people, in other words. So, how am I doing on time? Am I okay on time? Huh? 6:40 right now. Yeah. So, when do you want me to quit? When do you want me? Okay. All right. So, so this is collectivism here again. These are Mandan people. And what's interesting about it is that group cohesion over individual pursuits is what collectivism is all about. People in a collectivist society can sacrifice their individual benefits for the sake of the group. I like this. Members are less likely to betray members of the central in-group, right? Let me get past some of this here stuff here. Contemplation, meditation on sacred objects. This is another one of our people from our village back in about 1903. His name was Little Sioux. He was half Dakota and half Arikara. And Dakotas and Arikaras were often at war. So people used to say, if you were half Arikara and half Dakota, you couldn't get along with yourself. So it kind of worked, that joke kind of works. We look at this. This is a picture that was done by Andrew Newberg looking at these SPECT images. So I called up Andrew one day and I said, I want to use your images. And he said, what are you using them for? So I told him, I said, I'm using them and this. And he said, yeah, sounds great. So I said, in this picture, this man is kind of looking at these sacred objects, these pipes, and he's Of course, when you look at these, you realize the sacredness of them, right? How important they are and how happy and how they protect the people. And you get optimism and feelings of well-being and joy from that. So as he looks at them, you'll see I used Newberg's picture here, picture. You see that change in the left prefrontal cortex where there's a lot more activity going on in the brain. This is a picture of the Riccara society called the Ducks. And why the ducks, you might ask, right? You're talking about bears and buffalo and warriors, right? What about ducks? Well, to the Riccara, the ducks possessed all these special qualities that people contemplated on. Above all other creatures, they could fly, they could swim, they could walk on land, right? So in this particular picture, these are the ducks dancing, and of course, they're experiencing the oneness with all living things, right? As they're doing the dance, they get to this feeling where they get this feelings of timelessness, spacelessness, right? Self-transcendence, which is kind of what's happening here in this slide here. Again, this is another one of Andrew Newberg's slides, where the parietal lobe goes offline. And when Newberg scanned the brains of, scanned the brains of nuns and Buddhists undergoing these mystical experiences, they reported feelings of timelessness, spacelessness, and self-transcendence. And what he looked at, is the reduced activity he saw in their parietal lobes and the orientation of the brain responsible for perceiving three-dimensional objects, in space. So when these men are singing to this tree, having this very deep experience, because they're calling the tree mother. To them, it's a representation of grandmother, not to Wissawi saying in my language, the mother who comes to help the people. And they're having this experience after a long time, and they're not just doing it over a workshop, or a seminar for the weekend. This is kind of the part of their responsibility to society, is to act in this kind of way where they take the time to have this conversation and sing to this tree. They sing sacred songs. And as they do that over and over again, the parietal lobe begins to go offline, and then they experience this sense of oneness with the tree or all living things because of the reduced activity in this parietal lobe. And what happens is they have a connection, that the space between the tree and the person disappears. They connect, right? So now we know how Indigenous people, spiritual people, connected with land, with animals, with trees, with water, when you have this very deep contemplative experience. This is a picture of a Sundance tree. Let me get past this here. Let me go to this last slide here. So some of the things I was talking about, I think, are really all related to these kinds of practices, as it says, prior experiences in second bullet point. And training help deal with high levels of stress. So imagine singing and dancing and moving and prayer, inhaling, and blessing yourself with sacred smoke, living in a teepee all year round, sleeping on the ground, all these different kinds of things that people did, created this very dynamic sort of interaction with the world around them. And it wasn't that they did it very easily. It was training that did it, right? And when you look at this particular slide here, you see that there's an activation in the ventral medial prefrontal cortex. That's when someone is coping with stress in a healthy way, cognitively coping with stress. The other side is risky coping. And what this slide says, of course, is that prior training is really important. So last slide. This particular part of the brain is, the location, prefrontal cortex, located, in the frontal lobe and, kind of the bottom of the cerebral hemispheres. But what is implicated in, just like mindfulness would be, in the healthy processing of risk and fear, also plays a role in the emotional responses, like emotional regulation and the process of decision making and control. And finally, it also has a lot to do with the evaluation of morality. One of the stories I tell is that when I was a professor at Arcata at Humboldt State University, which is Cal Poly Humboldt now, I got a chance to spend time with Yurok elders and scholars and some of the holy people. And they told me these stories about how in the rites of passage, how they prepare their young men and women to be strong, right? To be resilient. And one of the things they did is they had these young people with just their grass skirts on, their cedar skirts on and vests on, and a prayer stick and an eagle feather. And they would run up these mountains at night, you know, when it was cold, with no GPS, no cell phones, and they had to know the trails. And the uncertainty was, of course, not only the trails and the darkness, but what was up there. Grizzly bears lived in Northern California at the time, so did mountain lions. But the biggest thing was the mountain spirits, that you couldn't violate, you know, the mountain spirits. You had to have a good mind, strong mind, and run up those trails. That uncertainty. The other thing they did was that they swam from the point on, I don't know if it was Patrick's Point, but there was a point they swam from the water and they would swim out to this open rock out there, which is like 300 meters from the shore in Northern California waters. So if you've ever been in the ocean there, it's cold. It's not like, you know, the South. You're down in Florida or someplace like that, or Palm Beach or wherever. It's cold. And not only is it cold, there are great white sharks in those waters, you know, along with whatever. And so they had to swim, keep in mind their point, sing their prayer song as they went out there, sing to the spirits of the water, and come back, right? And that was part of one of the things they did to kind of increase their, you know, resilient coping. But everything else was built in, like I said, the dances, the ceremony, the singing, and other things that I have in this presentation that I don't have enough time to get to. But I'm going to just end it there and I guess see if there's any questions. Thank you. Traditionally, you're supposed to give a war whoop, no, instead of clapping. There you go. Okay. Yeah.
I wanted to thank you. I also wanted to thank the person that gave the land document at the beginning. I'm here with my grandmother and my sibling and work with the Narragansett tribe. And I was really interested in when we were speaking about mothers and how, you know, this trauma can be passed on between mothers and children. And I was curious in particular about if that is something that only is passed on if something happens while the mother is pregnant, or can it be at any point preceding that, or is it both or neither?
I think, you know, it's indeterminate right now that I know of, right? I don't know. People speculate a few generations, maybe 5 generations. We know from the research that's gone on with Polish people, Poles during the Nazi occupation, that they were going through a period of starvation under Nazi, you know, occupation. A lot of people starved, and they, you know, a lot of their health was affected. So a few generations later, they start experiencing diabetes and heart disease and cancers and premature death. So it's pretty clear that, you know, there's a trail that kind of leads down. How far, I'm not sure of yet, but it's clear that there are, you know, some genetic markers that come from a long ways, you know, down, that are affected by that. When I was mentioning earlier, my mom ended up, she got sort of hit the gold mine with her COMT gene, COMT gene. It's one of those genes that, you know, has a different operations, but one of them is that it's related to worry. The worry person worries, or the warrior, right? So it's called the warrior gene. She got 2 copies of that gene that made her a warrior. My mom was about 5 foot tall, just, you know, really a kind person, but she was tough. She went through a lot of experiences, and you got through those experiences, you know. And I thought, well, where did you get that gene from, right? And then she told me what her grandmother was like and her great grandmother was like that, you know. I said, oh, maybe that's where it came from. My dad, on the other hand, was a worrier. He was half and half. He was half warrior, half worrier. So I got one marker from him. So I'm kind of a worried warrior, I guess, people say. But yeah, I think it's pretty clear that that happens with telomeres, and it looks like genes too also pass down that way, like inheriting some of my mom's genes, and she inherited those genes from her mother. So yeah.
Okay, first of all, if you have a question, come down to the microphone or it won't get recorded. But I think we were talking about this morning because I think some of it is also epigenetics, which is the expression of certain genes. And one of the things that we're finding are that a lot of that epigenetic transcription happens at the birthing process. And so I'm wondering how much of that is being passed on, like right at that moment, because there's so much of that happening. So it's a very, seems like there's so many different levels of that to be able to like put your finger on it. But the main thing I came to say is use this microphone if you have a question.
No.
Or that one.
I'm pretty loud, so I think I'll be fine. My question is, so I'm wondering how much genetic bottlenecks or endogamy affect some of the gene, resilience, because I'm an Ashkenazi Jew,
Mhm.
and I'm an Ashkenazi Jew whose grandparents went through, the camps,
Mhm.
and we have, an additional elevated risk from our genetics
Sure.
for many, genetic diseases. And I was wondering if in Indigenous communities, there's a similar endogeny, and if that also has resulted in elevated risk.
Yeah,
in that respect.
I think so. I mean, there's been a lot of research on before about whether Indigenous people had a gene that predisposed them to substance or like alcohol. Right? There's a lot of interesting. So people talked about it back and forth, and then after the human genome was explored, I at least read one paper where it talked about that. No, there's not really a predisposition toward it. What there is a lack of protective genes to metabolize, alcohol and those kinds of things, right? So they kind of reframe the question, right? Are there other diseases? Well, there are certain things like diabetes, for instance. Now, is diabetes a genetic flaw, or is it a protective factor, right? Because one of the things that accompanies diabetes is obesity. So some people have looked at that and said, well, a long time ago, we went through a lot of starvation. The people that had these particular FTO genes, I think it's FTO, would accumulate fat fast. They had slower metabolism, and they would accumulate, fat much quicker. These are the people that would survive the next famine, right? So was that a disease, or was that a protective factor, right? So in that sense, probably not. And again, there was you think about Turtle Island and the continent, there was a lot of movement. People didn't get bottlenecked, like you're talking about. There were some groups, certainly, but there was a lot of movement, a lot of moving between groups. A lot of children were produced by different groups and so on. So I don't know. Maybe someone knows the question that knows it better than I do. I just can't think of anything. Like you're talking about cerebral palsy or multiple sclerosis or things like that would show up. And I know a little bit about the Ashkenazi, and what happened with those groups because of that they couldn't, marry outside. There was a lot of endogenous stuff going on. I just don't think there's that much with Indigenous folks. So until after colonization, of course. So yes.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was really lovely and informational. I was wondering if you ever find analyzing such transcendent and like deeply meaningful experiences through the lens of the scientific method, do you ever find it limiting or even frustrating trying to communicate such profound experiences to people that speak the scientific language and use that jargon. I was wondering if you have any opinions or experiences with
Yeah,
that.
no, I haven't yet. I don't think I don't have any frustration. Maybe people just don't say anything to me, or but I don't. I think it's just another way to kind of take the research that people have done, and then to illuminate it through another prism, I guess, and said, well, this stuff makes sense. So I've had a chance to kind of sit down with colleagues that are pretty well known people that have done research in that way, and they say, it makes a lot of sense. It's important work. Most of the work I do it for Indigenous communities to kind of show that how important these things were, right? These are important things that you should return to. This is really important stuff. You're only a few generations away from those people that were doing these things, right? And so I don't know. It depends if they invite me back to this contemplative research conference. So I did the presentation there. So, but not so much. So, yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for coming and giving a talk tonight. I am an artist that is currently researching contemporary shamanic Hmong practices in America. My background is Hmong, and we are a nomadic tribe from Southeast Asia. And I am curious because I've noticed there's been a lot of adaptations to shamanic practices in America since immigrating here in the 80s and 70s. I'm curious about how sort of these indigenous spiritual practices have had to adapt and what that effect is, or I mean, maybe you could speak about, I'm not sure if you've done research on this, but what the effects of those adaptations might be on the effectiveness of neurodecolonization and I guess just their effectiveness.
Yeah. So, I mean, some of the stuff that I know, for example, in some of the ceremonies back home, like the sun dances, it's kind of interesting. I know you didn't directly ask this, but I'll kind of give you an example of how things have changed. That when during the ceremony, one of the things that happened is that the men who are dancing, they get pierced in the chest, and they put stakes through the skin, right? And they pull away and they break the skin and they sacrifice the skin to the tree of life. And that's kind of like you're giving, right? It's a sacrifice. And I remember after the AIDS epidemic began, people stopped using knives and those kinds of things to cut. So they had the Indian Health Service came in and they kind of brought all these scalpels in, so you could cut, sterilize those kinds of things. But that was kind of an interesting kind of change. The other thing is that practices have changed and that they've been shortened quite a bit. I mean, during a sun dance, you got 4 days of dancing, fasting, no water. It's tough. I mean, you can get close to renal failure, but you have to work up to it, right? And so you get that state. And traditionally, what people did is before the ceremony, they were there for 4 days to get ready, prayer, getting ready for the fast, and doing the sweat lodge and things like that. Then they did the actual ceremony. And then you had another 4 days at the end of it where you stayed at the village or the camp or the Sundance to continue to pray and get, taught about, the lessons you learned and have these conversations. So people come now from, let's say they come from LA or something, and they come all the way out to the res in North Dakota, or they come from wherever, Chicago, and they're there for their 4 days and boom, they're gone back to work. So it's just different in that way, right? Things have changed. You're not going to get the same kind of brain effects and the same, things happening in the brain and the body after after just a short period. In my case, and in some cases, things were outlawed for such a long time that they just got brought back very recently, within the last 20 years or so. So it's pretty novel to young people to try to do the practices, and even the people that are shamans or the medicine people to start doing those ceremonies. They don't remember the songs. They never knew the songs. They know some. Sometimes they have to have other tribes come in and kind of help, and then they learn what that tribe did, but it's not their tradition, so they have to make it their own. So that's kind of how they're piecing things together with, with colonization, intervening or destroying and upsetting some of that kind of stuff. So there's been a lot of changes. It hasn't been like the Hmongs who have kind of been going for a while, right? Yeah. But I mean, colonization happened in Vietnam too, right? So in China, yeah. Yeah, Laos, yeah. All those places. Colonization was happening, yeah. So things were changing a lot. So yeah. I don't know if I answered your question, but okay, yeah. Any other questions? All right. Well, I thank you very much for the hospitality, for your presence, and for the questions. And great night. Thank you so much.